Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are covering Carve Her Name with Pride, a movie that came out in 1958. It was directed by Lewis Gilbert and written by Vernon Harris and Lewis Gilbert. And it was based on the book Carve Her Name with Pride by R.J. Minnie that came out in 1956. Minnie was a British film producer, journalist, playwright, editor, author, jack of all trades. When he passed away, the actress who had played the main character in the film, Virginia McKenna, actually read the poem from the film at his memorial service. So it was one of his more well-known works. And I read a book about the main character of this movie, Violette Szabo, and that book came out in 2002. It's by Susan Ottaway, and it's called Violette Szabo, The Life That I Have. And that book pointed out some inconsistencies and uncorroborated info from the original book by Minnie. And some of those inconsistencies have made their way into the movie, but we'll definitely get into that. And the movie is available to watch on YouTube, should you so desire.
For free, even.
What are your impressions of the movie? Did you like it?
I did. I liked it more than I thought I was going to. I thought I was going to have trouble with the old-timiness of the movie, but it's actually pretty good, especially the second half.
Yeah, the second half gets pretty adventure-filled and action-packed.
It does. And I actually watched the movie at a slightly faster pace than the original pace. So it was less long and
Yeah.
slightly, because I feel movies were just a lot slower back in the day.
Well, you needed to have time for the whole romantic subplot and all that fun stuff, right?
Yeah, which I found really awkward because the kind of the face sucking kind of kissing is not my kind of kissing to look at.
Yeah, it's very of its time, the kissing is.
It is, it's very dramatic, but also it's kind of romantic. I like the idea of it more than I like the visual.
I think the movie itself is kind of its time as well. I mean, you
Yes.
can tell that it's made in 1958, but it tells the story well enough, I think. It's not 100% historically accurate. Obviously, they dramatized quite a bit, but I'm not mad at most of the changes they made in support of the narrative. Like, they made Violette's companions from Ravensbrück, which was the camp where she was executed, her old friends from training. Like, they made it that she had known them before, which is not the case in real life, but it serves the narrative better if she already knows them, you know?
I
Or they,
agree. I agree.
yeah. And they took out some things from her life in service of pacing. She had actually, we'll talk about this a bit more, but she had worked on an anti-aircraft battery for a while. And I thought that was really neat in the book, but I understand why they took it out for the movie. I don't feel like it hurt it not to have that in.
I do wish they'd included a little bit more of what she'd done before getting recruited, because they kind of mention her, like her skill set. If you know what she's done quite a lot, and quite a lot of useful stuff other than being both English and French. I feel like it's being kind of being glossed over a little bit, but
Yeah,
I also get why.
the movie really did make it so that she was just sitting at home one day being a sad widow, and they were like, why don't you come be a spy because you speak French?
I feel like she's done a lot more than that, and that's what made her so uniquely qualified, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe we should talk about her life story, including and the actual narrative of the movie, so that people understand what the F we're talking about.
The book that I read, like I said, it came out in 2002. And up until that point, the 1956 bio by R.J. Minnie was the definitive work on Violette Szabo, I guess, been famous enough. And so there hadn't been a bio in a long time. And then Susan Ottaway wrote this one in 2002. And she does talk about inconsistencies in Minnie's book and explains why she came to some different conclusions, which I thought was really interesting. I haven't read the original book, but Violette was born June 26, 1921, to a French mother and English father. And her childhood and her meeting her husband, who was a French legionnaire, all that stuff in the movie is obviously they play up the romance, of course, and there's a montage of her spending time with her future husband and him asking her father for her hand in marriage and all that fun stuff, because it's 1958 and you can't
Right.
have a movie starring a lady without a romance in it. But
I want to just quickly point out one of my favorite things about this movie, which is her friend being constantly in the way of her date. Her friend is like with her as like a chaperone on her husband. Her future husband is clearly so annoyed with his friend because all he wants to do is kiss Violette. The friend is
Yeah.
just always there.
Yeah. But there's a scene in the movie where her and her friend go to the park because her mom had instructed her to go find a French soldier to invite home for dinner because it was Bastille Day, I think. And Violette's mother was French, of course. So she thought the French soldiers might be lonely and missing home. So she told Violette to just go out and find a man. And that actually did happen in real life. She went and found Etienne and brought him home. And then in the movie, I believe they knew each other for only a few days before they got engaged. And in real life, it was a little longer. They knew each other for 42 days, which is still, in my
Right.
opinion, not enough time to know someone before you marry them. But
I talked to you about this before very briefly, but I thought it was very funny that in the movie, when Etienne asked her father for permission to marry her, he says no. At first, he says no because you've only just met. And then Violette comes in and she's like, yes, but daddy, you can't change my mind. And he immediately just decides, okay, I guess she's gonna marry this guy.
yeah, and that seems to be what happened in real life as well. Her parents were like, well, we could say no, but then she'll just leave and marry him anyway, and then we'll never see her again. So they just said yes.
I love her dad, especially in this movie. He's a very sweet man.
So in real life, Violette enlisted in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS, in 1941, and she was trained as part of one of the first mixed anti-aircraft batteries. Anti-aircraft batteries required significant teamwork. You needed someone to be able to find the plane in the sky, someone to be able to fire the gun. Like, it required a whole group of people to be able to man these things, basically. And women were allowed to do everything except the actual firing of the gun. It was as close to combat as women really were allowed to get. And she was stationed at Frodsham, Cheshire, near Warrington, from December 1941 to February 1942, doing that. And then she found out that she was pregnant, and she hid it for as long as she could. But eventually, she gave birth to a daughter, Tanya, in June of 1942. And the movie skips all of that, basically. In the movie, she meets her husband, marries her husband. He's in the French Foreign Legion, so he goes overseas to fight, and then she gives birth to a daughter. Bang, bang, bang.
I mean, it's clearly when I started watching the movie, I thought it was going to be all romance, but then I realized, as I already looked her up, that she was actually going to die, which then made the romance so much stranger to me. Like they put so much focus on the romance, but they make it a point to have her fight cause of HN, basically. And I wonder if that was true in real life as well.
So we'll get into that a bit later because I have some notes about the book versus the movie, but that part was pretty accurate. Etienne was in the French Foreign Legion, and essentially the French Foreign Legion ended up being divided. So some of them came to England to rally around Charles de Gaulle as the Free French, and some of them chose to remain and fight for the Vichy French government. And so Etienne was on the side of the Free French, so he went to North Africa to fight, and he ended up being killed in battle. He never got to meet his daughter. So Violette was a 23-year-old widow with a child, and a big part of her motivations was that when she was recruited to the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, she was interested in killing Germans. She wanted to get revenge for what happened to her husband.
Right. That's, yeah. That's just to be so young, then to get married so young, but then also to lose your husband almost immediately. And
Yeah.
to then be so motivated that she would leave her child behind. That's pretty intense.
Well, especially in that era, right? You have to
Yes.
imagine there's a lot of pressure on her to stay home and be the mom and raise the kid. They really emphasize the high adventure and the romance in the film, whereas the impression I got from the book was of someone who is very young and made some decisions that may have been impulsive, and some of which are kind of obscure to us now, and we can only guess at her motives because, of course, she didn't survive the war. So I think if they made this movie now, I would hope that they would let her be a little more human.
Yes, because I also thought she seemed pretty resolute immediately about what she was going to do. I mean, she takes some time to think about it, but don't really see any of her considerations. Which I think if it were made today, I feel like they would have shown a little bit more of her emotions and thoughts. And as they do in the movie now, it's all much more character driven than this old movie is. So
Yeah. And her motivations are very interesting because at the time, I mean, a lot of men went to war, and we don't ask ourselves why men go to war, but she would not have been expected to do this. This was not something that she would have, that people would have, after the war, that people would have said, oh, why didn't you become a spy and and go into occupied Europe? Nobody would have thought any less of her for not doing this. So her motivations are a little bit extra interesting, I think.
yes, if you join the SOE, you would still be classed as a civilian, right? Not an official like military outfit, is it?
I don't know.
Maybe I'm just asking the wrong questions here.
But yeah, so it was likely her linguistic abilities. She spoke fluent French, of course, because her mom was French, and her previous service with the Auxiliary Territorial Service that probably got the attention of the SOE. The author of the book that I read tried to figure out more information, but her file is unfortunately pretty scant. So we don't know exactly what about her caught their eye. But the SOE is a British organization that was formed in 1940 to conduct espionage, sabotage, and recon in German occupied Europe and to aid local resistance movements during World War II. She caught their eye somehow, some way, and she was recruited to go and work for them. She trained with the SOE, and we get quite a bit of this, I feel, in the movie where you see her learning how to blow up bridges, and she learns how to parachute.
And also gets injured on her first mission, right? Jumping.
Well, yeah, I think it's during her training. She jumps out of a plane and she hurts her ankle, sprains
Which
it or
is
something.
which is significant later on in her story.
Yes.
We'll,
Yeah.
we'll come to that in a second.
Yeah. So she went through all this training with them. From the sounds of it, the training was it was all men and women together. Everyone did the exact same training. Rain, snow, sleet, or hail. They were all out in the countryside doing maneuvers. They would give them a map and drop them off wherever, and they would have to find their way back. And
Good
so,
luck.
exactly. So the men and women essentially were treated exactly the same because they knew that when they got into occupied Europe, it was going to be life or death. Everyone would have to know the same fighting skills and all the same stuff. She finished her training and she had one successful mission under her belt where she went into, I believe, Rouen in France. And she was on a mission with a couple of other people, I believe, and they were there to find, there was sort of a section of the spy network where they hadn't heard from anybody in a while, so they were worried that people had been arrested, and the only way to really find out was to send someone in on the ground and have them go around and try and find these people and knock on doors and ask questions and try and be covert about it. But if there's nobody left in this section of the spy network, they're going to have to recruit more people. So that was her
How are
first
you?
mission.
How are you even going to find them at that point? Because they're no longer there. It must be so hard. At what point did you also then decide, okay, there's really no one there anymore, so now we have to go back
Right.
and find new people?
And of course, she's in occupied Europe, so there's Germans everywhere. And at this point in the war, there are, a not insignificant number of French people who would turn her in if they knew that she was a spy. So it's quite dangerous.
Yes.
And so she had that mission under her belt, working as a courier, essentially. And then she went back to England for a little while. And then she was supposed to go on a second mission, and it kept being delayed due to weather because they would have to fly over the channel and parachute them in.
Sounds familiar.
Exactly. Just like Band of Brothers.
No joke
So,
tonight.
yeah. So she ended up jumping into France on June 8th, 1944. So 2 days after D-Day. And as you can imagine, the countryside was swarming with Germans. She and another member of the resistance, Jacques Dufour, as well as Jacques' friend, Jean Barriot, encountered an SS roadblock, and they were able to fight their way free. But Violette was picked up in a nearby field, likely due to the fact that she had aggravated a prior ankle injury. That time when she sprained her ankle or whatever she did to her ankle there when she was parachuting and training. and she told Dufour to get to safety without her. She ended up being picked up by the Germans. She kind of shuffled around to a few different prisons, I guess. They had thought about doing a rescue mission, but they didn't know where she was. And eventually she was taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp and she was executed there on or around February 5th, 1945. And she and her husband, who, as we discussed, was killed in the war, are likely the most decorated married couple of World War II.
That's a pretty impressive resume from her, and so sad that she gets murdered.
Yeah, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross, the French Croix de Guerre, and the Médaille de la Résistance.
I also looked up a little bit of information about the George Cross because some people, like myself, might not know what it is. So I looked it up.
Yeah, I didn't know what it was either, so I was glad you did this.
The George Cross was created on September 24 in 1940 and recognizes acts of extreme bravery carried out by civilians and military personnel when not under enemy fire. The act which earns the award must be witnessed by several individuals.
So, book versus movie, probably the biggest change they made was you can't have a 1950s adventure movie starring a lady without some making out.
Exactly.
So they have
with someone other than her late husband.
Right, of course, because he unfortunately does not last very long. Etienne dies pretty early on. But they've created this character of Tony Fraser as played by Paul Scofield, and the character is fictitious. He seems to be an amalgam of a number of different men that Violette worked with. There is one man who is supposedly a romantic interest of Violette's, according to Minnie's book, so the book that came out in 1956. And the guy's name was Harry Pelevé, and she might have vaguely known him from training with the SOE, but Ottaway, the author of the book that I read, wasn't able to find any evidence that they ever were involved, including in Pelevé's own official report. So the only thing that she can think is maybe Minnie, the author of the original book, spoke with Pelevé, because at the time probably was able to actually interview people who were involved, but she doesn't have any evidence that this actually happened.
Tony in the movie does survive, right? Like Pelevé, probably. He did also survive, right? Yes. So that link is easy to make. And do they actually make out? I don't remember. Do they just kind of cozy up to each other?
Oof.
I don't think they make out.
I know they go dancing and they go on some dates and then they hold hands when they're both on the train being taken away to concentration camps, but do they make out?
I don't think they do. I think they kind of leave it like in another world they might have had a future together, kind of romance. Kind of
listen, they're not married or about to get married, so how dare they make out?
But I did like his character, to be honest. He was nice and charming. And also,
I don't think it really took away. If they had made the movie all about him, I would have been annoyed, but I don't think it really took away from the story. It was fine. I also don't think it was strictly necessary, but it's kind of ambivalent about it.
I'm just now that we're doing this podcast, I'm wondering, what is the title Carve Her Name with Pride referring to? Do we know?
Oh, I don't know.
Right. I don't know either. Funny, I didn't see it anywhere. It's not like mentioned or anything. It's not a line in the movie or.
Well, maybe we'll look it up after, and if it's something dumb and obvious, we'll cut this part.
Sure.
Yeah. So we know that in real life, Violette had told several people that her motivation was to kill Germans in order to avenge her husband's death, and he was the love of her young life. It feels hard to picture that she would, jump right into bed with some other dude, but I mean, it happens. We can't rule it out. But Etienne himself was a French Foreign Legionnaire, and he was killed on the 24th of October, 1942 at El Himaimat, south of El Alamein, fighting for the Free French in the North African campaign. Losing him may have been why she made some possibly foolhardy decisions. Like on the day that she was captured by the Germans, she was carrying a weapon with her. Her cover story was that she was a secretary or something like that. So if she were to be stopped by the Germans, as she was likely to be crossing the French countryside in the days after D-Day, it definitely would have blown her cover story. So it really was not safe for her to carry that, but she insisted on it. So there's some speculation that she may not have intended to return to England, or at least she was devoted enough to her husband's memory that she thought it was worth the risk.
Right. I do wonder in the movie, it's a pretty hefty gun. Like, I wonder if it's accurate, but I haven't checked.
I believe it is, yeah. She was carrying like a big old semi-automatic or something like that.
Saying like I like in the movie I think she gets to the river and she's almost trying to cross it after her friend also crosses it. But then she just stays put. She just gets shot in the shoulder, I believe. She then gives the Germans hell for a bit before she's picked up by them.
Yeah. So in real life, she did not get shot. She
Uh,
was picked up with her bum ankle. RJ Minnie's book and the movie to a lesser extent, and a lot of the media coverage talked about how she was apparently tortured. But I gather that female British spies were not really tortured based on what we know. I mean, there were exceptions, obviously, but generally speaking, the policy seems to have been they were treated better than French women who got picked up, and they were obviously treated better than male spies who got picked up. Of course, later when she gets to Ravensbrück, she's not getting enough food and they're putting under forced labor, so that's a type of torture as well, of course, but not the getting smacked around and waterboarded and all that stuff.
in the movie, she is kept awake for 2 days, I believe. She looks pretty hellish. So the makeup in this movie is very good. She looks like
Yeah.
she's like death warmed up, really.
Yeah, they did allow her to look surprisingly haggard.
Yeah, and even especially when they get to Ravensbrück or Ravensbrück in the actual pronunciation.
Yeah, all right.
Uh,
Just subtly coming for my ass there and my terribly anglicized pronunciation.
but she looked actually like she looked thinner and the makeup looked pretty good. And also I wonder if it looks so good because it's in black and white.
Yeah. I mean, very possible. So of course this movie is in black and white, and I actually looked up when color movies started to be predominant because I was just curious. And it was toward the end of the 1950s. So this would have been in the last generation of films really to be made in black and white, except for artistic films, of course.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And I do want to mention quickly something about the ending of the movie because I didn't think I was going to cry at this movie because it's so old and it's kind of janky in some bit. Like the thing that took me out of it most was it seemed to be like some of the actors sometimes would appear to be walking to their spot on the floor very precisely. Like you'd see them like walk and then stop like very precisely. But the end of the movie made me cry. So it's pretty sad and well done also.
I also found the end of the movie emotionally affecting, and I was, like you, a little surprised. I'm not a big crier generally, especially in movies, so I was like, oh, there's a small tear.
And I feel like we should mention something that's pretty vital in the movie and also it's the title of your book. That's her code poem, The Life That I Had.
In the movie, as you said, there's this running theme where when Violette's in training, she has to choose a poem that will be used as her poem code. Essentially, they would, at the beginning of the war, they had this thing where each agent would have their own individual poem, and then they would have a code that was based on that poem. And it would be secure because there was no way to decipher it unless you knew the poem. But the cryptographer who actually taught Violette about all of this stuff, Leo Marx, pretty early on, he identified that there was a more secure way to do this than using a poem. So they pretty much switched methods, and they were using this new method where they would print a pre-existing sort of code cipher on silk paper that could be like easily destroyed. So at this point in the war, they weren't really using poems anymore. But anyway, in the movie, she has to choose a poem, and she chooses this poem that is supposedly written for her by her husband. So we see her husband read it earlier in the movie, I believe, and then we see her read it aloud to Leo Marx. And this thread keeps getting picked up of this nice romantic poem that Mart will read for you.
The life that I have is all that I have, and the life that I have is yours. The love that I have of the life that I have is yours and yours and yours. A sleep I shall have, a rest I shall have, yet death will be but a pause. For the peace of my years in the long green grass will be yours and yours and yours.
Leo Marx headed the codes office supporting resistance agents in occupied Europe for the SOE. And after the movie came out, he stated in his memoirs that he had written this poem, and that was kind of the story that got ran with for quite a long time. But in the book that I read, the writer had looked into it a little bit more, and she had a source who had given her quite a lot of good, solid, accurate information. And that source told her, actually, no, that poem was commissioned for the movie from this gentleman who was a publisher and a poet named John Pudney. And apparently, if you read his other poems, they're kind of in a similar vein to this one, I guess. She went back and looked in R.J. Minnie's book from 1956. The poem is not mentioned at all. The first mention of the poem happens in the movie. And because the SOE files would have still been closed to the public at that point, and there are so many historical inaccuracies in the movie, Ottaway believes that it's likely that they just commissioned this poem for the movie.
I find this really curious because there's a museum about Violette in England. I've looked up where it is and I'll tell you later. But it was started by her aunt, and they do say that this poem was made by Leo Marx. But I feel like that information might just be old information even for them.
And even as you said, the title of my book is Violette Szabo, The Life That I Have. So there's a big part of the myth making around this woman.
And it's pretty. It's a pretty poem.
It is pretty.
Let's add some more context to Violette's story. You can do it because I'm gonna mess up the names.
Okay. Well, there were 41 female Section F SOE agents that served in France. And Section F just means the SOE was divided into various different sections based on what kind of espionage they thought these different sections thought might be more effective to win the war. So Section F, these guys were going into occupied Europe. Some of these female agents were there for more than 2 years, embedded in whatever their position was. Most were there only for a few months. It was really difficult because they were couriers or they were radio transmitters, and these were super dangerous jobs because if you were caught, you were done. The Germans knew you were a spy straight up.
And also, they would probably start recognizing you after a while. So if you were seen often, it would become more dangerous.
Exactly. And they alluded to this briefly in the movie, but Violette has a little conversation with one of her handlers about how she's double checked that all of her clothing is French. And that was the thing too. It was they had to make sure everything down to the tags. They would go through their pockets, their purses. They couldn't even have so much as like a cigarette butt from the UK, because if they got picked up by the Germans, like they would go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. So you had to seem as French as possible, right down to the make of your underwear, basically. Of the 41 agents, 26 of them survived the war. 12 were executed, including Szabo. 1 was killed when her ship was sunk. 2 died of disease while they were imprisoned, and 1 died of natural causes. So in the movie, we see Violette at the concentration camp, and she's executed with these 2 other agents, Denise Bloch and Lillian Rolfe. And those were indeed the 2 women that she was executed with in real life. And the movie makes them into friends that she's known since she was in training, which I thought was a great narrative choice. It really tied the story together and made it more emotionally impactful. These weren't just like strangers that Violette met in the last few days of her life kind of thing. And along with the 3 of them, 1 other member of SOE was also executed at Ravensbrück, which was Cecily Lefort, and she was killed in the gas chamber sometime in February of 1945.
I read up on these ladies briefly, and apparently neither Denise nor Lillian was able to walk to her execution, so they were wheelbarrowed out to the spot where they were executed.
Yeah. Well, it really sounds like they dragged them out and they made them do hard labor in the cold all day. I can't remember what it was. They were working in logging or something that was very labor intensive. They didn't have winter clothes. They weren't given enough food. So by the time they got to their execution, they were pretty rough.
I do wonder why they were executed. Other people survived.
Once you were caught, you were probably going to be executed unless you could be rescued, or it was late enough in the war that you made it to the end just by sheer luck. In the movie, there's an older woman that you see quite often in Violette's scenes where she's meeting with kind of the higher ups in the SOE. And this woman is based on a real person, Vera Atkins. She was a Romanian-born British intelligence officer who worked in the France section of the SOE from 1941 to 1945. And her primary role at the SOE was the recruitment and deployment of British agents in occupied France. So she, for whatever her job title happened to be, she was pretty much the second in command around there. And after the war, there was some controversy because there were some parts of the war where it was thought that they should have known that certain parts of the spy network had collapsed, and they just kept sending agents in anyways. And that resulted in potentially unnecessary loss of life. So there did end up being an inquiry into it. And it was never found that there was any wrongdoing. Everything that happened was determined to be an error. But after the war, Atkins was extremely diligent about trying to trace agents that were still missing. And they assumed that she was motivated by a sense of guilt at having sent many to deaths that could potentially have been avoided.
Horrible.
Yeah.
But yeah, so many strong and amazing ladies in the war that we don't often see, that we're not often told about in movies or in books. Really glad this movie's out there. I was just going to mention again briefly the museum about Violette is in the UK in a town called Wormlow, and it was started by Violette's aunt, and Leo Marx apparently attended the opening.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I get the sense that her family has always been really into the idea of preserving her memory. She obviously had a daughter who was very young when she was killed, and her daughter, as an adult, didn't have too many memories of her mother. Obviously, had never met her father, and so she was raised by her grandparents, I believe. When the movie came out, they were living in Australia, and they were really excited that the movie was being made, but they didn't even get invited to the premiere or anything like that. So I know,
Do,
kind of
do
grim, right?
we do we know if the movie Tanya, her daughter, gets her George Cross, I believe, and awarded to her by King George?
Yeah, so apparently
King
that did
George?
happen.
That's pretty amazing because she was only a little girl.
Hers is an interesting story. I think the reason why it is so famous is because she was executed, which was uncommon for women in wartime. And because she really, I mean, that was her second mission. There were quite a lot of people who did undercover work, unsung stories, if you will, of World War II. And her story just happened to be one that captured the imagination.
Can you recommend some more? Because I know you know some more. You know more about this
Yes.
than I do. Please
So
enlighten me.
I tend to get lady spy books for Christmas because people assume that I'll be into that, and they're correct. So I've read, and I really recommend A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II by Sonia Purnell. And it's about an American named Virginia Hall who spent quite a long time spying in occupied Europe. She organized resistance forces towards the end of the war to help the Allies as they were advancing. She ran her own spy network, and she had a limp because I think she may have had a fake leg, or anyway, one of her legs was really injured, or it was, something like that. And so she had quite a pronounced limp. And so the Germans had this crazy bounty out on the woman with the limp. They didn't know who she was, but they were like, this
Wow.
lady is a real thorn in our side. We need to get her.
Right. Can I just I'm looking at your notes, and can I just I've not read any of these books, but can these authors maybe pick slightly shorter book names?
They really love a title and a subtitle, eh?
Yes.
So the next book is called Code Name Lee's: The True Story of the Woman Who Became World War II's Most Highly Decorated Spy, which you're right, it's a very long title, by Larry Loftus. I haven't read this one yet, but apparently it's very good. Someone bought it for me for Christmas, so that one's going to be coming up pretty soon on the docket. And there's another one called Agent Sonia, The Spy Next Door by Ben McIntyre, who you will recognize as the author of SAS Rogue Heroes and Operation Mincemeat.
Hold
And
on a second.
yeah, and he actually wrote another book that I read recently called Agent Zigzag about a male spy, which was also very interesting. And I haven't actually read this Agent Sonia book yet, but I've had it forever. It came very highly recommended to me, so I'm excited to dig into that one too.
I need to know something else. Have you returned your book that you borrowed yet?
Oh, Unbroken? No, I haven't been able to return it yet because the lady on my trivia team that I borrowed it from wasn't at trivia last week.
How dare she?
I know. Rude. I just want to get this book off my plate.
of
Actually,
your
interestingly, my Violette Szabo book that I have, whoever bought it for me, because again, it was a gift, must have gotten it secondhand because there's an insert in it where I guess the book originally came from the museum because there's a
oh,
little
really?
museum pamphlet inside. Yeah, let me grab it. So it's a little insert, and it's from this place called, oh, I don't know if this is the same museum actually. This museum might be where she actually trained, but it says during World War II, Arisaig House, which is where this pamphlet is from, was requisitioned for use by the Special Operations Executive and became a commando finishing school for around 3,000 men and women, providing the final stage of their training to serve in occupied Europe. Maintaining a rigorous security was critical. With only one access road, the area was easy to seal off as a special protected area, and even locals were required to have a pass to go in and out. Violette Szabo, whose short life was the subject of a film and many books, was one of the brave agents who trained at Arisaig House. So
That's
yeah, that's
cool.
kind of neat.
Yeah, if we ever get back to the UK, we should visit some of these places.
Yeah, I would be definitely up for that. A little World War II tour of the UK.
I mean, we'd be there for months, I think.
I can live with it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We kind of forgot to rank this movie for about an hour, so here's us ranking this movie out of. What are we ranking it out of? You can tell the
So
people.
I think we've decided that going forward, we're going to stick with ranking things out of 10 in the interest of consistency. And for each movie or TV show, we're going to choose something particular to that movie or TV show to rank it out of. So in the case of this movie, we are going to rate how many overwrought love poems out of 10 would you give this movie?
Well, I find this movie really hard to rank, actually, but I would probably give it 7.5 overall love points out of 10. How about you?
You know what? I'm feeling pretty similar about it. I was going to say maybe 8 overwrought love poems out of 10. I think that the historical accuracy is middling. The overall story is right. They obviously shoehorned in the romance and changed some things here and there to suit the narrative. But I think the back half of the movie is really action-packed and exciting, and the acting is pretty good, and the end was very emotionally affecting. So I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it also. I just feel like it's a product of its time, but for that being what it is, it's a good movie. That's my final say.
Yeah, agreed.
Perfect. So, what are you reading now? Are you reading anything?
I am. Last month I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans,
I'm so
and
jealous.
it was great. Honestly, I can't recommend it enough. I mean, it was very obviously an American museum, a lot of rah-rah the US with only some brief mentions of other countries, but that's kind of to be expected. And the museum itself was extremely well done. And while I was there, I picked up this book called One Women's Army: A Black Officer Remembers the WAC, which is the Women's Auxiliary Corps, by Charity Adams Early. And she was actually the first Black woman commissioned into the WAC. And she, in fact, would have been the first woman, except that they normally commissioned officers in alphabetical order. But because the WAC had Black platoons, they decided to segregate it by color. And so the white women got commissioned. Yeah. So
Okay.
I know. So she ended up being promoted to major. She commanded the Central Postal Directory Battalion in Europe, which was the only unit of Black women to serve overseas during World War II. And she eventually, when she left the WAC in 1946, she held the rank of lieutenant colonel, second only to that of the WAC commander.
That's really cool. That's gonna be an amazing read. I wish I had any updates about my reading, but I'm still at the same page, at the same word. So I guess we should not mention my reading anymore.
Well, they're apparently making a movie about Charity Early, so maybe when that eventually comes out, I'll lend you this book. She has such a dry sense of humor, and she's shedding a lot of light, I would say, onto racism that she faced and kind of the differences in the army at the time because she was a Black woman.
Listen, I feel like we should be invited to this movie premiere when it happens. I feel we should set this goal for ourselves to be invited to go.
Listen, someone at Netflix, call us.
Hit us up. What are we doing next week? You know? Of course you know. We've been talking about
I do know what we're doing next week. Y'all. You know what? You tell the people what we're doing next week. You did this. You did this.
It's my fault. Next week we're talking about Pearl Harbor, the movie from 2001.
You know what? It's so funny. Yesterday I put in on one of our online servers where we talk to other World War II nerds. I said, "Hey, does anybody have any thoughts on Pearl Harbor? We're going to be covering it." And someone said, "I tried to rewatch it for you and I only got 32 minutes in and it was so bad I had to shut it off."
I was in my formative years when I watched this movie, and
Yeah.
it shaped me, okay? But I'll talk about it when we actually review the movie.
Yeah, it's a big nostalgia pick. I don't think I've seen it since high school. Like it's been a good 20
Same.
years.
So I secretly watched it yesterday in preparation of our pod next week. So I really enjoyed it. But I'll talk about it when we record that podcast.
Yeah,
So
I'm planning on watching it as well, and we're going to talk about some of the historical inaccuracies. We're going to deep dive into all of that.
exactly. So all that's left for me to do right now is thank you for listening and to let you know that you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer podcast. And you can also subscribe to us just about everywhere you find your podcast. And if you have any questions or things you want us to watch or read or talk about, please let us know. We would love to hear it.
Absolutely.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.